Well, since shortly after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment has guaranteed that children born in the U.S. are U.S. citizens. Next year, the Supreme Court will make a critical decision, that is, on birthright citizenship, making a ruling after President Trump issued an executive order to end it. An order blocked nationwide by several courts. Supporters say a change is needed. And as KLTV7's April Peerdot reports, East Texas immigration attorneys are already getting questions.
I'm experiencing a high volume of calls, a lot of people coming in, not because they necessarily need my help or want my help, but they're scared.
Since January, Ginger Young, an immigration lawyer at Flowers Davis and Tyler, has been witnessing panic in the community.
There's a lot of unpredictability right now. This issue is unpredictable.
Earlier this year, President Trump issued an executive order removing the recognition of automatic citizenship from children born in the U.S. to temporary visitors or non-citizen parents, also known as birthright citizenship.
Birthright citizenship has been the law of the land at least since the 14th Amendment.
It's been an established amendment for nearly 150 years, since 1868. Anyone born in the U.S. is a U.S. citizen, with exceptions from children born to diplomats and foreign military forces. In the amendment, it states all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. The executive order challenges the wording of the amendment.
The people that are supporting the change in Trump's interpretation of the law is that the United States doesn't have jurisdiction over people that are here temporarily, like temporary visas.
This also includes those who are undocumented. Many supporters of the executive order believe the 14th Amendment is outdated and in need of a change. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has long pushed to limit birthright citizenship for children of undocumented immigrants. He has opposed in-state tuition for these students and has sued groups who he says support open borders. We reached out. Attorney General Paxton's team did not get back to us. Senator Ted Cruz's team referenced his prior statement made on a legal filing last month, which states that birthright citizenship is an abuse of our system and is an incentive for illegal immigration. He believes it is unconstitutional and continues stating that he hopes the Supreme Court will affirm that American citizenship is reserved for those who abide by and uphold our laws. Based on 2023 U.S. Census data, about 22.8 million foreign-born, non-U.S. citizens live in the country.
I think once the Supreme Court rules moving forward is where we'll see the change.
The Supreme Court's ruling could redefine how the U.S. interprets the 14th Amendment's guarantee of birthright citizenship.
Regardless of the result, if this does change, does it open the doors down the road for a different president to change it back? Or does it open the doors that a different president or this president on a different level has the ability to change the Constitution?
April Peerdot, KLTV 7 News.
Arguments are set to happen this spring with a Supreme Court decision expected.